So this session is talking about long-term goals and targets. Thanks for joining us, everybody. I'm Janet Peace. I'm the head of advisory services at Anew. Random question: how many in here have heard of Anew before? See, I knew I loved you guys. I mean, it's a new name. We're a merged company from last year, Blue Source and Element Markets, under the TBG Climate Rise Fund. But you know, with branding, and I'm sure many of you have been through this process before, branding is kind of continuous. Anew, who are you? What do you do? Well, for a couple of decades, Anew, Element Markets, and Blue Source all together, we have been working to provide solutions to help companies move forward on climate. And as anybody would tell you that knows us very well, as a company and personally, we believe that corporate action is essential for addressing climate change. That's not to say that it's the only thing that needs to happen. Of course, we need policy. We need some incentives from some cool new technologies out there. But governments can't do it by themselves, so companies are super important. And if you're going to take action, obviously you're going to want to plan. You're going to want to set some goals. And so that's what we're going to talk about in this session. So this is the first part of a two-part session on corporate action. This session, we're going to talk about goals and climate commitments, and after lunch, we're going to talk about how do you get to those goals and commitments. So I'm fortunate to have two other friends here to talk about this topic with me. Miguel Sossa is the Vice President for the Western region at, I'm going to get it right, Climate Impact Partners, another new name, but they've had their new name longer than us. And Edwin Makkinga, he's the Manager of Climate Policy at Enbridge. Thank goodness you've not changed your name, just saying. And in just a minute, I'm going to ask each of them to say just a couple words about their connection to goals and long-term climate commitments. But first, I wanted to show you a little slide. If I can do it. Did that work? Okay, Miguel. Okay. Miguel's the technology expert here. There we go. Okay, so a couple days ago I started putting together, what kind of advice is out there for those who are thinking about net zero goals? What kind of frameworks are out there? I'm telling you, I couldn't get it all on this slide. There's report after report after report. I mean, McKinsey, Deloitte, everybody's got a report on how do you get to net zero. So what I decided to do is I thought, okay, let's talk about the main frameworks that you probably hear about in the press. Science-based targets, PAS 2060, that is out of the British Standards Institute. They're all about carbon neutrality. The UN high-level expert report on what do we think is a credible net zero goal and how are people getting there. VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, that's all about how do you make a credible claim. ICVCM, Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. Oh my God, there is like an alphabet soup here. And it's no wonder people really don't know what's the right framework to follow. So I was thinking about these frameworks, and there's a lot of things in common when you look at these. Almost all of them say, you got to start with the mitigation hierarchy. Reduce emissions at home first. Be transparent. Set a long-term goal, set interim goals, not just long-term, but talk about how you're going to get them sometime not waiting until 2050. They all talk about transparency. Talk about how you're going to get there. Talk about what you've done. Tell me about your journey is basically what they're asking for. All of them, except for the net zero, say, hey, I recognize you're going to have to use carbon offsets. That was surprising to me, but I went through each one, and absolutely everyone except SBTI recognizes that carbon offsets are going to be part of the journey. But it is kind of crazy. And why are there so many frameworks? I mean, I've been in this for a long time and was part of something called the Offsets Quality Initiative a very long time ago when I was at the Pew Center. And I can tell you there weren't this many frameworks. So why so many today? And I think it's because there are just so many companies and cities, towns, universities putting out these net zero goals. And people really don't know how to get there. So there's all these different frameworks to really help all these companies. About a fifth of the largest 2,000 global companies, public companies, have net zero goals. A good site, if you're ever interested, is that UN Net Zero portal for the Race to Zero. 3 days ago, I looked at it, and they listed 8,000 companies, 8,250 to be exact. This morning, they listed 7,000. I don't really know what happened. But 7,000 companies is a lot of companies with net zero goals. And that's just companies. There's way more than 11,000 if you included universities, if you included cities, towns, et cetera. But a lot of companies are trying to figure this out. And so you got a bunch of frameworks, and that's what we're going to talk about here. Michael Sossa at Climate Impact Partners, for the last few years, they've been doing a study that have looked at these long-term commitments and what large companies are doing. And so I thought maybe to get us started, it would be useful for Michael to kind of give an overview of what their insights from those studies have shown.
Sure. Go one slide down.
Yeah, trust me on this?
We got you all day. Just leave it there. I think you're good. All right. So good morning, and thank you very much for the front row, the middle rows, and back rows. So we have 1 seat, 2 seat, 3 seat, 4 seats to give you the space. My name is Miguel Sossa, and I'm the Vice President of the Western Region for Climate Impact Partners. Show of hands, how many people have heard of Climate Impact Partners? Yes, the entire leadership team is in the front row. Those of you who may know us as Natural Capital Partners or Climate Care, we've both been around since 1997 when all of this really kicked off. And last year, we finally completed an incredible merger bringing our two companies together. So today, I want to talk to you a little bit about what we do. So we are in the space not only of helping our clients look at high-quality carbon instruments, but also thinking through how to make credible claims. And one piece of work that we do is we work with the Global Fortune 500 to survey and see where they were making credible claims. Now, I'm going to step out of the way because I see you all taking pictures. But I'm going to do just a quick illustration and also to wake you up a little bit. So back in 2010, I'm going to ask this small segment of the room, if you're able, to please stand up. This is 3% of the Global Fortune 500. Give me a little bit of rope with the percentage. Okay, and now we move ahead to 2015. I'm going to ask those that are able to please join us. Okay, now that's supposed to be 6%. That's a hefty 6%. So think about where this is going. So now we head over to 2020, and this doubles. Now we're at 20%. So I'll ask y'all to stand up. It's just a good exercise. Look what happens in the period of just 2 more years, 2022, and I have y'all stand up here. And my leadership team can't do. 42%, give or take my rough percentages, of the Global Fortune 500 have made long-term commitments. But if you look at the scale at which this is growing, this is exponential. Y'all can sit down. I appreciate it. And why is this then important? There's no doubt that as we hit the decade of change and the lead up to trying to accelerate this to 2030, that we see scale. But any time that a peer of a peer of a peer makes a claim, then it's not only good business sense to join in when possible, but it also adds to the gravity of this momentum that we all need to do something. But they're doing things that are critical. They are using either science-based targets or they're working on a carbon neutral claim, but they're moving in a direction that for us is critical. But this is not true across all sectors. So I'm going to ask Janet, if you don't mind, to move the slide down one. Thank you. This is called carbon partnership, by the way. I love this. It's not doing it, but we're going to come
Didn't I
over
do
time.
it?
I have a feeling that I was destined to be in IT.
You might.
But I'll be in.
But we
client
appreciate it.
solutions. Well, I appreciate it.
Okay.
And let's see what happens now.
Does
There
it
we
show
go.
up? Okay.
Okay. One more picture. I see a lot of people taking photos. Go ahead. So what we know about this, and this makes common sense, in harder to abate sectors, the targets have been set further and further and further out than those sectors which have the ability and the financial support to do so. But again, this is all very critical because if we think about where you providing supply and where all of us are helping our clients to think through this, we have to start somewhere. And so as you can see, the technology sector has really been at the forefront of this. These are the Microsofts that many, many years ago said, we're not only going to help to become carbon neutral, but we're going to take it way back to when we started. And if you have examples on high across different sectors, it only promotes and galvanizes the rest of those communities to come and do it. So I'm going to tell a quick story, and then we're going to pass it back to Janet. Before I joined Climate Impact Partners, I worked for a little airline known as Delta Airlines. So some of you may have taken me to LAX. It's going to take me 2 hours to get there when I get here. Go back to 2019. Go back to when everyone was traveling. And Delta Airlines had a unique decision to make. A really progressive CEO, Ed Bastian, wanted to create a humani splash. He had just joined Global Citizen. And he was looking at what they could do. What claim could they make that would shake up the sector? And I remember being in the trenches because it came down to our sustainability team at Delta to give them ideas. Everyone wanted to approach it with science. Here's what it means. Here's if we take the fuel down 10%. Here's what we think we can achieve. And this is what we think it's going to cost. And inside, as he was thinking about this, it was too scientific. There was too much in the weeds. He said, people and our customers are not going to understand this. Then the financial piece came in. Hundreds of millions of tons a year that they had to figure out how to do. So they got the CFO involved. Then they got the marketing team involved who asked many questions. What's the risk to us? What's the exposure if we make a claim? How could this come back to life? Then they went to the operations team and said, well, you know, we know we're going to get skewered on greenwashing if all we're doing is buying offsets that have no internal reduction plan. So what can we be doing as an organization to reduce our fuel consumption? How can we improve the aircraft so they're not as old, more efficient? What can we do on there? And on February 14th, 2020, let that date sink in. Not only is it a beautiful day, Valentine's Day, but it's also what Delta calls profit share day. And it's when everyone in the company gets to enjoy the fruit of a hard year's work of labor. Ed Bastian on February 14th got in front of the world and said, we are announcing today, we are committing $1 billion with a B to become carbon neutral by 2030. And forgive me, but that scared the shit out of us. Because we knew financially what that meant. If you calculate that, that's about $2.50 a ton. That's a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, President Trump shuts down travel to Europe. And a little bug called COVID snuck up around the world, paralyzing the entire airline industry. And yet, a year later, Ed Bastian didn't blink. He stuck with that commitment. 2 years later into COVID, stock prices tanking. We've had to ask people to take voluntary leaves. We've had to let people go. He stuck with that commitment. And why? Because he knew that climate is not about the financial impact 1 year versus the next. It is about creating a claim that if you're going to stick with it, you better damn stick with it for the long haul. And I was proud of him because it was not easy. And he's still doing it. And we'll talk a little bit today about creating those claims and why it's so important. But you all play a significantly important role in their ability to tell stories about high-quality offsets, carbon instruments, that have a story rooted in climate impact. So thank you for that. And we're going to get back to the other stuff. But thank you very much. We'll get to that other slide in a bit.
Okay.
So we can just I'll come back to here so we can just do this.
You know, Miguel, it's really good that you know how to make that work.
We'll just leave it at
Okay,
that.
okay. Thank you very much. So Edwin, if you could say a little bit about your role at Enbridge.
Sure.
And you have a net zero goal. So Miguel talked a little bit about Delta and how they got there, maybe you could talk a little bit about how Enbridge
Sure.
got that goal out, how the whole process went.
Sure.
What about those? Okay, just keep going.
Sure. Okay. So my name's Edwin Makkinga. I'm the manager of climate policy based out of Calgary, Alberta. And so I'm part of Enbridge. If you're not familiar with that, we're a leading North American energy delivery company. So we've got, we own and operate natural gas and crude oil pipelines that run from, BC and northern Alberta down to, the U.S. West Coast, or sorry, not the U.S. West Coast, the Canadian West Coast, down to the USGC, Gulf Coast, Midwest, Southeast, and Northeast as well. And then we've also got one of the largest natural gas distribution utilities in North America, based in Ontario and Quebec. And then as part of that utility, we're actually one of the first pilot projects to start blending green hydrogen into the natural gas distribution grid. So we've got a small pilot project there for about 5,000 customers where we're blending 2% hydrogen into the natural gas stream to reduce emissions associated with that. And then we've got renewable energy offshore in Europe as well, and then here in Canada, and looking at investing in things like more hydrogen, obviously, and then carbon capture and storage as well in Alberta and other locations. So, Janet asked if I could just speak a little bit to the development of our greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, and I would say off the start that really the foundation of us setting targets was based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the corporate reporting and accounting standard, which probably most of you are familiar with. And I feel like for us, that was really the 10 steps that kind of set out how to set a credible target with a strong foundation in existing protocols and reporting structures. So back in 2019, I believe it was, our senior management basically commissioned us to look at setting a greenhouse gas emission reduction target, recognizing the importance of us not only reducing our own operational emissions, but also supporting the reduction of emissions for our customers and the folks that we deliver energy to. So I was part of that initial team that started working with our business segments. So we've got about 4 or 5 different business units. They're very distinct. Obviously, we've got pipeline operators and owners, crude oil, we've got a utility, and then we've also got a power group as well. So basically, senior management asked us to start working with the business units to determine what was a feasible target. But not only that, to push ambition as well, obviously. So throughout 2020, senior management and the board provided us with guidance and support. And I think what's critically important in terms of setting a greenhouse emissions reduction target is having senior management backing you. I know I started working on targets when I think it was like 2016, give or take, when I moved to Calgary from Ontario, and one of my first roles there was to start leading reduction targets. So we got only so far, obviously, but once senior management said, in 2019, this is something that we have to do, obviously, everybody's going to work towards that, right? So I think that's critically important. So in November of 2020, so glad we're a little bit ahead of the curve there in terms of the bulk of folks doing it in 2022, we set our next generation, our new generation of greenhouse gas emission targets, with the first one being net zero by 2050. And the intent there is that it obviously aligns with the goals of the Paris Agreement, but also the findings of the IPCC. I think those are 2 critical points there, that we wanted to make sure that our targets were science aligned. And then we also set emissions intensity target for a 35% reduction by 2030. And basically the intent there was, as we kind of talked about already, is having an interim goal. And the other part of that was as well as basically in establishing internal processes to integrate the consideration of carbon and climate into investment decision-making choices. So one of the things that came out of that was for any new M&A project, for example, that we have, or a new investment, that project needs to demonstrate a path to net zero before we'll invest in it. So I think it was public today, but so Enbridge invested, I think, a 50% share in wood fiber LNG, which is an LNG export terminal off the west coast of BC. So I think today we released our net zero plan for that particular facility. Hopefully. I know I saw it in my email. But then also Ingleside. So Ingleside Energy Center is located just south of Texas on the USGC, US Gulf Coast. So basically it's an export terminal for crude, but then we're also looking at exporting green hydrogen and ammonia off there as well. But one of the pieces there was, when we were evaluating it, was how can we make this facility net zero? And one of the big pieces there was Scope 2 emissions. So what we decided was we're going to install a solar facility on the property to basically offset all of our, or basically feed all of our electricity to that particular facility. And then any additional electricity will actually go into the communities surrounding it to reduce their emissions as well from the grid. So that was a really big piece that came out of that. So just in terms of our approach to setting the targets, so we're operational based. So it's only emissions that we have operational control over. We're covering scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is another big piece. We did look at scope 3, so we do report on a small portion of our scope 3 emissions. And I know someone, I think yesterday, was talking about scope 3 guidance and whatnot, and the lack of clarity and guidance and whatnot. But we have embarked on getting a better sense of our scope 3 emissions across the board, so we haven't set a target there. But our 2018 is our base year. So the reason for that was we acquired Spectra Energy, I think it was in 2016 or 2017, which is a pretty major M&A for us. So basically 2018 was the first year that we had real good data. We had verified data. So obviously we want to work with data that's strong and verifiable before we actually start to report on any performance there. And then the other big piece as well is that the targets are tied to employee compensation as well as senior leadership compensation. So that's tied into your scorecard. So basically, if you're getting a bonus, for example, one of the multipliers within there at the business unit level is whether or not you've hit your target. So as part of our governance structure, each of the business units have their own emissions working group, for example. They'll set targets at the beginning of the year in terms of what they expect to do, kind of based on the marginal abatement curve that we kind of talked about a little bit earlier. And then hitting that target obviously leads to a multiplier.
So Edwin, you've got a long-term goal, you've got interim goals. How did you have your plan fully formed before you put that target out there?
We did not. I think we had. Well, I think we did out. We did out to 2030, but I think post 2030 to 2050, I would argue that. I don't know, X number probably did do a peer review on that, and you can probably talk about it as well. But I'm sure a lot of companies don't have a clear view out to 2050 because it's going to be based on things like CCS and fuel switching and green hydrogen and all these things that. Not to say that I guess the technology is somewhat nascent, but I would say out to 2030, we definitely had a pathway. That's right.
Yeah, it's when you get out to 2050, it's not quite as clear cut. Miguel, right. when you're advising companies that have a 2050 goal, I'm sure you find, like we do, that there's some concern. I'm not really sure how I'm going to get out there. I'm not really sure how I'm going to get there. And am I going to be credible if I put this 2050 goal out there and it says I'm going to do direct air capture? Mm-hmm. Maybe that's not going to be economic by then. Who knows? I hope it will be. But how are you advising clients who have this 2050 goal and they're not quite sure whether they should move forward with announcing that goal or not?
I think to think about 2050, we have to go way, way, way back. So if you can...
Yeah, you're going to trust me on this?
I trust you. Just
okay, we'll
drop
see.
Down a couple, and if not, I'll swing on over. When we think about 2050, we go back to what the world was like right in the 1997, 1998, 1999, 2000s.
I'm a failure.
It was the wild, wild west of carbon. And I will come and help you.
Yeah, because I'm a failure at this. Yeah. I'm touching the buttons.
It's all about it. You're doing great, though, I said.
Oh, you have to do that, too?
Yeah, you have to do so many things that is just... All right.
They never would hire me to run the IT.
Climate Impact Partners for your IT needs. So if we go back to 2000, it's the wild, wild west of creating claims, okay? And so the challenge is, how could we create a framework to help customers think through not only what they're going to do in the short term, but have ability to do so time and time again? And so working in consortium with NGOs, with academic researchers, with corporate partners such as yourself and others, we developed back in 2002 what's known as the Carbon Neutral Protocol. And in this protocol, we set out how clients can think about creating credible claims. What type of scopes do they need to offset for things that they can't reduce internally? And how do they begin communicating this in a way that is both transparent but also built on science? And what we found, Janet, is that it was so hard for them to think 2050 that they needed an on-ramp to do so. So being able to focus on carbon neutrality and looking at, well, how can we easily sort of quantify what emissions we can't reduce internally, and how can we then link up with a company to purchase offsets such as ourselves to help do that in a quality way, that it gave them a mechanism to clearly not only communicate it to their internal stakeholders, but to the rest of the world. So then when we think about 2050, the challenge is less so about, okay, what what exactly do we need to buy in 2050? It's what are the muscle memory things that we need to do now with our leadership team to get them ready? As you can imagine, trying to get a procurement officer to understand why a company is going to spend $10 million in offsets is very difficult. So we don't necessarily need to go all the way to 2050 to have that conversation, but we need to say, here's the impact and the claim that you're trying to create as an organization for the betterment of society, and here are the different steps that you're going to take to get there. And we'll talk a little bit more about sort of how we're transitioning to removals and that whole focus, but really getting the procurement cycle and the leaders that ultimately have ownership of this to understand how they can go about buying things that for them, I mean, how many procurement officers do you think have been out to the middle of Africa to see a project? No. So we're the conduit not only to storytelling, but we're also the conduit to helping them understand where their money is going and why. And this all goes back again to quality and being able to help showcase the approach to do so. So just something to share. But we're going to do this in the spirit of hopefully going back to there. Now we're back at the neutral slide.
Okay.
Okay, for the rest.
You know, the issue of carbon neutrality has been around a long time. And I was really happy when the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, VCMI, talked about carbon neutrality and said that it could be that on-ramp. It's a place to get started. And they had some criteria in there before you can have a credible carbon neutrality claim. It talked about using a third-party standard for carbon neutrality, having it verified, putting out your goals, being transparent. But I do think it's nice that others recognize that carbon neutrality is a nice place to start on some pieces so you don't have to do everything all at once. Exactly. But I want to come back to you now, Edwin. Mm-hmm. So you got this 2050 goal, you got the 2030 goal. How often do you think you'll have to update these goals?
I think that's a two-part answer. I know when we set our 2030 target, one of the expectations was that we would periodically revisit that target just in terms of making sure that our ambition, I don't know, like obviously that, you know, our target remained ambitious, and I was going to say, like, I think our current performance, we've reduced our emissions by 28%, but I think the other piece of that is a lot of engagement that we're doing with different investors as well, and stakeholder groups and shareholders. So I think the big one is CA 100. Is it capital? Is it Climate Action 100 Plus? Mm-hmm. So I know they've engaged with us probably for the last 3 years or so on our targets. So not only during the development of the targets, we engage with them, but also on an ongoing basis as well. And Climate Action 100, if you're not familiar with them, it's basically financial investors and insurers and basically holders of capital that want to make sure that companies that they're invested in are setting, you know, obviously setting credible targets and whatnot. So obviously they're you know, working with us to increase the ambition of our targets. And I think one of the biggest asks that we get, not only from them, but also from shareholder resolutions and whatnot, is first of all to set a Scope 3 target. So certainly that's something that we're looking at. And I think as a midstream organization or a midstream entity as part of the energy value chain, it's a little bit of a challenge. Again, not to go back to the discussion from yesterday around Scope 3, but what Scope 3 emissions do we claim, I think is the big piece of it. So thinking about our utility, for example, we deliver natural gas to customers, and I think for us that would be a good starting point in terms of like a Scope 3 emission. So when we think about increasing ambition, I think it's not only our target, but then also the boundaries associated with the target, like a Scope 3. But I think the other piece of it as well is stakeholders, like Climate Action 100, is switching from an intensity-based to an absolute target. And in my mind, I think that's where we would probably shift from sooner than 2030. Like our idea is really to shift from intensity-based to absolute in 2030. But I think, you know, given the pressure and whatnot from I think that's probably more likely to happen sooner than later.
Yeah, I think the fact that there are stakeholders out there mm-hmm. that are pushing, and I mean the IPCC report that just came out a couple days ago, you know, it really intensified the focus, if you will, on corporate action. And as this focus on corporate action, I would say, has gotten more laser on what companies are actually doing in these net zero goals, there's also increased pressure on, well, what about greenwashing? Are you actually doing anything? Or are you just talking about it? How do you avoid, I mean, you have a very long-term target. How do you avoid the greenwashing argument?
So I think when we initially came out with our 2030 target, I think we were very cognizant of that whole notion of greenwashing, right? And I'm sure we've all seen other, and now again, not to point fingers or whatnot, but I'm sure we've seen other companies even setting targets out to 2030 that don't necessarily have a credible pathway there of kind of discuss what that's going to look like, and much less so to 2050, which I think is probably you can, let's say justify it a little bit more easy. But so I think like in terms of when we came up with our target, we wanted to make sure that we had credible pathways, and I don't know, I guess I can go basically through them quickly, but so the first one is basically modernization of existing assets. So, that could include things like increasing energy efficiency, using AI, so artificial intelligence, to increase energy efficiency of crude oil flows, for example. And then also electrification, I think, is another big one as well. So if we have maybe like an aging asset that's natural gas fired, like a compressor, for example, switching that over to electric obviously would help us meet our targets. And then capturing natural gas from things like, if we have to do maintenance on a pipe, for example, capturing that gas instead of venting it, which obviously methane is a pretty major consideration there.
Are you putting all those out in your plan? Are you saying?
Yep. So there's a document online. I think it's like our net zero by 2050, which basically goes through all the steps.
So transparency.
For sure.
Miguel, how are you advising companies to avoid this greenwashing picture that is increasingly coming up?
You hear the word transparency time and time again, but I also think it's internally aligning leadership to understand why they are all involved in this. Mm-hmm. So if you have someone at the top that says we're going to be carbon neutral, but the entire organization is not tied to that mission, it's hard to really be credible in the actions that are taking place. And additionally, we look at it on where the client is. So we, as some of you may know, we are not a consultancy, but we advise our clients nonetheless, and we appreciate the opportunity to do so. But we have clients that are along that corridor of sophistication. I see some of our clients in the room today who are leaders in industry, know exactly what it means to go against greenwashing because they have all their ducks in a row. They show their third-party certifications. They have the reduction plan like Edwin has in place. We also have brand new customers and clients to this marketplace. Folks that just graduated college with all the best intentions in the world but have no idea how to set up a plan. And their first ask when they join a company, can you create our net zero plan? And sure. So for those, we're taking them through methodically to first identify what are the different areas of impact that you can create over time. Let's not try to bite everything at once, and let's try to understand how that ties back to what you can actually reduce. And by sort of holding folks' hands, which all of us do up here and all of you do too, we're able to help move them forward so that they feel strongly about how it does it. Now, unfortunately, we, as a sector that's growing, we've come under fire time and time again. And I don't see that changing. Anytime there is positive impact happening, there's always going to be someone that has an exception with it and is trying to improve upon it. And I don't think there's fundamentally anything wrong with folks trying to improve upon it. I just wish they'd take a more scientific approach to doing it and give some guidance as to where they fall short on their logic so that we can help everyone get to common ground. But there's a lot to be said to just trying it out, and I'm proud to be part of an industry that has given it a go, because if we don't, I really don't know what else the hell we would do. So.
Yeah, I've asked a few folks, so if you don't want to engage in the market, what's your option?
Exactly.
I've just been asking lots of questions. So I want to open it up if anybody has a question in the audience. I mean, I have many more, but if anybody wants to jump in and ask a question, we could take a couple now, or I can just keep going. Question in the back? Just speak up, and I don't know if we have a mic, so.
Thanks. I wanted to ask you about looking at a net zero plan, the trade-off between short-term profitability and climate action. How are you going about quantifying those decisions, like whether to allocate capital this year, 5 years from now? Can you talk a little bit about that process? How do you quantify it?
Could you say who you're with, too?
I'm a student at UCLA.
Terrific, thank you. I think a lot, so I'm a lowly economist, but I do think knowing what your emissions look like, and as Miguel said, what your opportunities are, looking at your marginal abatement cost curves internally, and how you're thinking about investment and acquisition in the longer term, helps you decide about when and where to put the money. Miguel, do you want to jump in, or Edwin?
I'm curious about your financing. How are you thinking about doing this?
I was going to say, I'm not like a finance person either, and I was going to kind of add during my little spiel at the beginning there, one of the I think the important things that we did was bring on somebody from finance. I think early on in the development of the process, because I don't know, I've got like a bachelor in biology and some other stuff, but like I'm definitely not an economist or a finance person. So, and this person is continuing to run kind of the enterprise-wide approach to it, right? And kudos to him, because I like the whole MAC curve. I mean, I can understand it from a conceptual perspective, but you're kind of bang on in terms of you need to understand the economics of it, right? And maybe a good example would be, so in terms of like investment decision making, obviously for us, like we want to have investments that have a low risk, long-term return, like a stable, obviously return, and I think in recent years, we've added a component of carbon into there as well. So not only looking at it from a carbon compliance perspective and climate, obviously climate risk, but then as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, making sure that you have a net zero plan for that particular asset, whether it's an existing asset or a future asset. So when we think about carbon compliance, for example, one of the projects that we're working on currently is we have a number of pump stations in Saskatchewan, the province of Saskatchewan, and their grid is fairly, I would say, carbon intense. They still use a lot of coal in Saskatchewan, and our compressors are electric driven there. So obviously our Scope 2 emissions are particularly high. So one of the projects that we're looking at is behind the meter solar. And basically the idea there is that we would not only reduce probably our power costs, but we'd also reduce our Scope 2 emissions by generating our own solar electricity versus using electricity from the grid. So I think from that perspective, you're not only looking at the economics of it in terms of like energy price, but you're also looking at it from the perspective of emissions, right? So you're basically netting out, that dirty electricity, for lack of a better word. So I think that's like one of certainly the big ways that we're looking at it. And I think as an organization as well, thinking more broadly, like, obviously we do scenario analysis, like based on the IEA in terms of like where we see energy mix going into the future. So, for us, that drives investments in things like hydrogen and CCS and, leveraging existing infrastructure and that kind of stuff, like for carbon transportation and whatnot. So I think from that perspective, it's also economic, right? Like in terms of this is where the puck is going, and this is kind of where we want to make our future investments.
Puck, that's definitely a Canadian thing.
I'm not a hockey player, but yeah.
Canadians in the audience. The other thing that makes me think about rather, is the fact that enables setting a price for carbon up front. So one of the challenges about waiting to get to net zero before you really start is that you haven't really trained your organization to think about what that actually may cost. And when you start pursuing a claim, whether it's even just a small piece, we're going to offset our business travel, or we're going to do carbon neutrality, what that forces the organization to do is to say, this costs this at an average price per ton of X. So we know we're going to spend that on offsets, or we're going to spend that on internal reductions. There's a comparison now for your finance department to really have that team. Yeah. And as you've heard that term finance time and time again, the thing that we're really asking our clients to do is to get them involved early. Because the earlier that they can be a part of the process, the easier it is for everyone to come to the table with their needs. The final piece that we're seeing is really a shift from buying when you need to buy carbon, from buying it spot, so every single year coming to the market. And when that happens, you're at the mercy of the fluctuation of pricing in the market. And instead, our clients, particularly those with larger footprints, are saying, what strategies do we have so that we can look at long-term projects, so that we can create a more normalized curve that is easier for us to budget every single year. And that's where we're looking at project development and other ways of doing long-term project financing to support it. But just shout out to you for coming. I think we need more and more students to be here, so thank you for representing UCLA.
Shadow pricing used to be kind of a hot topic. So you build in a price and think about that as you make your investments. But it's nice that Miguel made the point about buying. When you buy renewable energy certificates or you're buying offsets, you're paying a price. That's an internal price that it's going out the door. And that price can help you, how much you're spending on that, that's an internal price that's actual real and making a real emission reduction somewhere else. And that comparison has to be part of the conversation about when you do your internal abatement. So it's Microsoft used to have a nice little show and tell about internal carbon pricing, and they charged every business unit a tax, and then their CFO got involved. But buying offsets is kind of like that. It's a price, and you're actually seeing that price. So it's part of the story. Another question over here?
Yeah, Walker Stanovsky, I'm a lawyer at Davis Wright Germain, and I think one of the interesting things in this whole space is kind of the cross-pollination of blurring lines between voluntary and governmental efforts. I mean, in the space of this entire conference, really. So I'm curious, in the context of these claims, you know, what, if anything, is the role of government? And to sort of give 3 U.S. federal examples, EPA's got funding under the IRA to increase transparency and standardization of these claims. SEC is considering, do investors need to know what you're doing to warn them once you've made them? And the FTC is considering updating the green guides and adopting presumably more detailed guidance, potentially even regulations about what kind of advertising claims you can make. So those are examples. Europe's got others, but just curious your thoughts on what, if anything, government should be doing around these claims.
I may take a stab at that to begin with. I mean, you forgot CFTC.
Yeah.
TCFD. I mean, there's a role for government here. And, you know, the U.S. government has an all-of-government approach right now. So there's different guidance coming out about different things, whether, I mean, EPA has a discussion about how to count carbon. So will they weigh in on the greenhouse gas methodology for accounting? What about market-based accounting? So they may weigh in on that. So I think having guidance from the government is not a bad thing. The USDA got the Growing Climate Solutions into the budget bill, so that actually tells USDA, you need to figure out how to get your farmers better involved in the carbon market. And they've got a couple different ways to do it. One is kind of a smart agriculture, kind of a stamp like we do with Energy Star. So you get a premium on climate smart cotton. Pretty cool, huh?
But so do you see like that, for example, feeding up into these sort of enterprise level, long-term, you know, neutrality, you know, targets, or?
It's part of where things are going. And SEC telling, you know, public companies, you will disclose 1, 2, 3, and you will have it verified. You'll have an audit, just like we do with taxes. I mean, that's not final yet, but we'll see where it goes. Disclosure is a hot topic right now. And I think in the next 2 years, greenhouse gas accounting and disclosure are going to be what everybody's focused on, because it's important for companies to put this information out there and be credible. I don't know if I answered your question, but you guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, we see the challenge in Europe especially, right? So with France being very, very strong about how you can make a claim on carbon neutral products, so working with clients to say, well, how does this fit into what you're trying to do? We have had some clients that have backed out of announcing that their product in France is carbon neutral because they want to understand how that policy is going to impact them. Whereas we have other clients that are in Eastern Europe, or further east, I should say, that have actually used our certification in court to help say, look, this is the credible way that we have been able to do this. And that has helped the government think more broadly about the role of third-party assessments. So I see the interplay being very interesting over the next few years, but a great question.
You know, the funny thing is, a lot of the court cases, like the UK one and then the one on climate neutral milk, what the court said was, you're not transparent, you're not telling me how you do it. You need to be transparent with those claims. And a third-party verification doesn't hurt. Question in the back there?
Yeah, so...
Could you say who you are, too?
I'm sorry.
Could you just say who you are, too?
Jim Zhang, I'm CFO of a biotech startup.
Cool.
I'm tech-based.
Thanks.
So aside from Delta, right, you got these publicly traded companies making plans 10 years, 30 years out, which doesn't happen in any other context. How do you get a conviction from your executives, right, the boards? They're sucking it out, their comp is tied to performance. And then two, how do you lock in, how do you guard against sort of down pressures, you know, to companies sort of top line, bottom line, all that stuff? I mean, 30 years is a long time in business
Yeah.
with fiduciary duties.
Yeah. I don't know.
That's just clearly for you.
No, and I think that's why I was kind of saying at the beginning why it's so important to have senior management on board, right? And for us, like we have a climate policy that we established, I think it was like 2016, which basically talks about, like recognizing that, global greenhouse gases are obviously an issue, but energy demand is increasing globally. So we kind of see your role as, providing energy with, like a lower emissions intensity or, lower, supporting those goals, right? So I think from like a senior management perspective, it was both a recognition that climate change is obviously a challenge that we need to deal with. We have operational emissions that we need to reduce, which obviously aligns with our climate goal. But then it's also really important to our customers, right? But it's also really important to our stakeholders, like the communities that we operate. We have pipelines that run through Indigenous or communities and tribal lands, and a large number of different stakeholders are obviously involved. And then we obviously have shareholders as well, right? And I kind of talked about, like Climate Action 100 Plus and a number of other like PRI, investors and whatnot that, have significant holdings with ourselves. And it's obviously important to them as well. So I think it's important from an economic perspective, obviously, when we see, a large number of I think we were one of the first midstream companies to set, a target. But when you see, obviously, it happens broadly, you obviously want to, I don't say like we were kind of ahead of the curve there, but I think it makes business sense. But then it also makes sense from like an ESG perspective, right? Or not. And I know kind of social license has kind of fallen off as of late, so I think it makes sustainability sense, for lack of a better word. So I think when it's important to them and it's important to employees and they're all kind of working together, like, I think that's kind of where you get the buy-in, and then I can't really necessarily see it like falling off going forward because as an organization, we set up an additional business unit a couple years ago. It's New Energy Transition or New Energy Technologies. It's basically the intent of the whole business unit is to look at emerging tech and clean technology innovation, right? So for us, I feel like it's more embedded than it obviously it was previously, right? So I don't necessarily see that stepping back, but I think it's economic and sustainability linked.
Companies don't tend to put goals out and then like to not meet them. It's kind of embarrassing.
Yeah.
So it's not like government that, okay, we're going to have this policy and then next week we're not going to have that policy. Not that governments do that, but a few do. But it's hard and embarrassing for a company to step back from a goal.
It is. And I think the impetus is a couple things. Let's all be honest, right? The majority of CEOs are going to retire before 2040. Yes? So they're making these goals knowing full well they won't be around to see them implemented.
There's that.
Okay? So what's in it for them? One is legacy, which people play on all the time. Go talk to Mark Benioff. He thinks he's going to become the first trillionaire because he's planting trees, which is amazing, right? And he cares a deep deal about nature. Now, Mark Benioff is a smart person, and I'm sure he did the calculus that this is going to be a competitive advantage for us to do this as well. So there's legacy, there's altruism, and then there's competitive economic analysis. I mean, how many of you studied business in school or took an economics class, right? So there's Porter's 5 forces and all of these things, and being agile and meeting the needs of a sustainable, focused world. When you look at the next round of consumers that are coming up, they're all mission-oriented. So you're going to gravitate towards something, and that's really what makes it sticky. The more important thing is if you are a leader, so thank you for being ahead of the curve, Edwin, but if you are a leader and you can go find a second or third to be there with you, now you're going to pull the entire industry with you. And I think that's where you're seeing a lot of these consortiums coming up like Global Citizen, where you're having people that say, hey, it's kind of scary to be out here alone. Can you come and join me? Now, we see the counter, right? So we see some other clients that, things got really rough for them. And the last year has been extraordinarily tough economically for many different sectors. And so now it's more convenient to say, gosh, the carbon offset market really wasn't what we thought it was. So we're going to pivot and we're going to take our reductions elsewhere. And they're not clear where they're going to come from. So it's a time in history where I think they're pivoting to try to not only save face, as Janet said, but to make the payroll. And we have to understand that. I think it's foolish of us to say that everyone's going to be able to participate 100%. But the key is to keep going, and I think we need to not punish people that need a moment to pause, because I know I've always needed a moment. So I hope that's helpful.
And things don't always turn out like you think they're going to. So a little bit of a delay, I think that's okay. I don't see a problem with saying, okay, we're not going to do carbon capture and storage this year. We got to prove this other technology up first. But you know, your shareholders, and Miguel and Edwin both mentioned shareholders are a big part of this story. And you just look at the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure and what they're asking and saying should be in the SEC rules in terms of tell us your targets, tell us how you're going to get there, tell us about the governance of meeting those targets. It's a lot different than it used to be. Question right here.
Great question. So first of all, I think there's both an industry sector related reason, and then there I think is an actual leadership reason. So imagine if your organization is managed by someone that thinks this is all crap. Probably not going to be top priority to go pushing for it. We'll pause there, no judgment. Then you're taking a look at sectors. I mean, it's really hard for the real estate market to figure that out. There's a lot of embodied carbon in what they do. It's really hard to replace wood with something else. So concrete, they haven't really found a structural alternative that can be produced at scale. So it's tricky for them to say, sure, 10 years from now, everything is going to be made of carbon neutral concrete, no problem. It's really hard to stick your neck out there and do something that you're not actually sure you can pull off. And it's very different than an airline, which has the same struggle, but can see a path maybe with SAF, can see a path maybe with efficiency. It's really, really hard. So I think seeing clear line of sight to being able to achieve something helps it out. And then I fundamentally believe that leadership and their views in life and morals, et cetera, has something to play in that.
I was just going to add to that. Like, when I see a private company that sets a greenhouse gas target, I think that's pretty notable. And like lots of kudos to them for sure. Because I would, obviously public companies, the shareholders are pushing it. But like from a private company, I mean, you don't necessarily have to, right? But like when they do it voluntarily, I think that's great. Yeah. And
especially small companies. Small
Right,
companies
exactly.
don't often have a chief sustainability officer.
Yeah.
Or even a department where they even know what their greenhouse gas footprint looks like.
Yeah.
So smaller companies, it's definitely harder. But that's where this focus on Scope 3. And I used to run a business council for Pew. And I remember having workshops on greenhouse gas accounting. And the word fluff or just undoable and nobody's going to do Scope 3. This was 5 years ago. It's changed. It's changed a lot. Scope 3 is part of the conversation today, and it's really about pulling and giving the resources to some of the suppliers so they too can move forward. So it definitely has changed, but they're not there yet.
And I want to build on that. I think for those of you that have never really delved into a corporate before, many people think that a sustainability team is an army of people, but oftentimes it is one.
No.
One and a half.
He's got some help.
Right? So one thing to ask of you all, which we hear often is, thank you very much, is to ensure that when you are documenting, for those that represent projects in the room or work with projects in the room, make sure that you're documenting, that you have data in a way that is easily digestible, because more and more and more clients are now getting on the need to have more due diligence. They're being asked by their leadership, really, did you dig into this? And no longer can just simply say, yep, we trust so-and-so. So being able to have accessible quality information and data that they can look at is super, super helpful. And I know it's not easy. Projects are supposed to be out there creating the impact, not producing reports. But there's something to be shared here in terms of being able to have data that is easily consumable, that can be helped presented up leadership chain of command, and also done so in a timely fashion. And that's really what they're under the gun to do. So anything that you all can do, great. And obviously that interplay is important. But yes, they're very, very small teams trying to do a lot very quickly. and they all rely on our network of everyone being in this market to help them out.
I think we have time for one last question, and then we'll have last couple of remarks. So please introduce yourself.
Jeremy Casey with One Tree Planted. Miguel touched on it, but curious your thoughts on how corporates are aligning their long-term commitments with procurement of quality credits over time.
So
You can start.
just quickly, I see there is a stronger focus moving towards having high quality as a definition. Back in 2008, we helped co-found ICROA to give that sort of quality element to it, but even more so now, we're seeing that rigor improve, more questions around due diligence, having more of us move forward. Obviously, we can talk about ratings and the role that they're all playing. It's happening, similar to how quality impacts stock markets and other commodity and assets. So I think more and more quality that can be produced for data documentation.
The market's maturing.
Yeah.
There are people who are coming out with, like the ICVCM. Here's what you have to do to be credible. 20 years ago, we didn't have these registries. We didn't have ACR, although Winrock did have something. The registries have improved the credibility and the transparency a lot. And they're continuing to evolve. You do one methodology and you update it, and you update it, and you keep updating it. So I think that the registries having their stamp of approval, and there's multiple registries, right? ACR, BCS, Gold Standard. Did I miss anybody? CAR. Oh my God, how sad is that? Sorry, don't tell Craig.
We'd like
Okay?
to thank our sponsors.
Please don't tell Craig. CAR was one of the first. So it's important that these registries continually improve and the methodologies continue to improve and transparency continues to improve. That's what it's all about, is making sure that it's continuous improvement.
I would just add one point. Like we're currently in the midst of we're working with KPMG in developing our carbon offset strategy for post 2030 because we feel like that's the point where we're going to need it. And I'm not necessarily involved in that so much. That's more the other group. But I know one of the first questions I ask when we get somebody who has prospective offsets available, for example, is what protocol you're using, right? And nobody wants to be accused of greenwashing, right? Which I think why the VCM is so important, right? So I think and thinking about I don't know, tribes and indigenous groups, for example, a lot of them are, want to be able to participate in that market. But coming back to the whole notion of capacity building, and I think that applies not only here, but also in developing nations as well, that whole piece around how do we provide that capacity support for them to be able to engage in the voluntary carbon market, because there's so many co-benefits associated with it. It's not only greenhouse gas reductions, but it's also cultural benefits and societal benefits, and there's all the other pieces, right? Biodiversity and whatnot. So I think one of the big questions that at least I have, in talking to these these groups and whatnot, is that how can we build that capacity for them to be able to engage in the VCM, because it's so important. At least that's one of the things that we think about.
We find companies really always asking about the co-benefits.
Right.
So tell me about the social benefits. Tell me about the habitat protection. Tell me about the watershed protection. And I'm sure you guys find that same. Miguel talked about the story.
Right.
And that's those co-benefits. Yeah. What parting words in 1 minute would you have for the audience?
So at the end of the day, Janet and I represent companies that sell high quality offsets, and we go to war every day to build market share. But behind the scenes of that, we are here to create climate impact. We are here with you all to create climate impact. And I think leaving this week, this is my first NACW, I feel even more aware of what it's like to be on the supply side and the impact that you all have and the needs that you have. And it's been really, really reassuring to see that. But I'm very proud that we keep doing this together, because we have to. And it's just a pleasure to be here. So thank you for having me.
Any last parting words?
No, I was just going to say, we didn't really talk about public-private partnerships, but I think, policy is so important in this space too, and we talk about the convergence of the VCM and the compliance market, and having that government support in terms of, in Canada, we've got a market-based, carbon pricing system, right? So we've got a lot of quantification protocols and whatnot, and I think that really boosts the VCM as well, at least in Canada, right, in that whole convergence. So I know for us, it's definitely working with the government in terms of what makes sense in terms of the development of quantification protocol for renewable natural gas or hydrogen or CCS or whatever it happens, renewable electricity, right? So I think that's extremely important as well in terms of like mobilizing the capital into these new technologies.
I think get going and be transparent on that journey.
Yeah, that's good too.
Thank you all for joining us. Please join me in thanking our speakers.